2, 1, we're live. Jim Hemphill, writer, director of The Trouble with Truth, nominated by Mary Lou Belli. Welcome to the show, Jim.
Thanks so much for having me.
So I checked out, you're very welcome, thanks for being here. I checked you out, and I checked out the movie, The Trouble with Truth. You've got some interesting themes going on there. It is, well, I'll sum it up, in my opinion, in terms of faith versus hopelessness.
Mm-hmm.
And you got a couple of interesting things going on. Just kind of give a general summary, and then I'll ask you the first question, which is your artistic inspiration for the film.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to give the viewers again a general summary. Let me know if you're going to jump in here anytime. There's one line that sticks out, and I think sums everything up nicely between the two characters. That is essentially a love story, again, between the hopeless and the faithful. Chasing your dream and having them not happen. Chasing your dreams and having them not happen is worse than never trying. So a character says that, and then you have basically this, optimism versus cynic, which nicely, correlates with those two themes mentioned earlier. This luck versus hard talent, despondency, and then the necessary of growing up, the necessary of adulthood, fighting for family, and sustaining and faith and fidelity, and all those things are rolled up into there. So again, that's the way I summarize it, is essentially faith versus hopelessness or faithlessness. And what are your thoughts about that? How does that fit with your understanding of the movie that you wrote and directed?
Yeah, I think that's a great assessment, actually. I've never put it into those terms, the faith versus hopelessness, but that's a really good way of putting it. And I think in terms of my own, where this comes from, I would say all of that represents two sides of myself. I think the two characters, people have asked sometimes if the John Shea character is me or things like that. I mean, they're both kind of me. I think I veer between hopeful and hopeless, or romantic and cynical. I think probably the kind of key line in the movie in a way for me is there's a point where I think it's John Shea's character says something to the effect that, cynics are actually at heart romantics who have kind of been beaten down by life or been disappointed by life or something like that.
Right.
And that's, probably that tension just is in me all the time. And so that's sort of where the movie comes from. I mean, that's kind of the personal inspiration. And then the cinematic inspiration, I think, is probably, some of them are probably pretty clear, like My Dinner with Andre and movies like the Before Sunrise trilogy, although more Before Sunset than the other two, probably. Before Midnight actually I don't think it even come out yet by the time I made this movie. So it was kind of interesting when it came out and I saw how much of that movie took place between the two characters in a hotel room, sort of like the final third of my movie. But that was just kind of a coincidence. But anyway, I think your description of it thematically is dead on.
Well, thanks, and I'm glad it is, because I think in terms of what you said, a lot of people, I think it's human nature to wrestle with those, and for some, it's often difficult to find a firm foothold in one place or the other. So, which can be a good thing if you're on the hopeless side, and can be a challenge if you're on the hopeful side. And how do you maintain your footing there, which is a happier place, which I think is ultimately, what the movie is trying to reconcile, is how to lead a happy life.
Yeah, and I think some of that, a lot of that also comes from just being someone trying to be a filmmaker and make a living in the film industry, because I think to make movies, you have to I think you get a lot of no's from people. There are a lot of struggles. You come up against a lot of obstacles. So you sort of have to retain this almost unrealistic optimism at times to keep trying to make movies. And then, the realities of how difficult it is sometimes, although it's easier now than it used to be, just because the technology has made it easier. But you still, it may be easier to make movies now, but it's still difficult to get them seen and to make people aware of them and all that. So you're always kind of up against these difficulties, and I feel like it's very easy to become cynical or bitter. So probably a lot of this, in a way, is almost it's almost like an allegory for filmmaking itself, this movie, even though I never really thought about it that way until just now.
No, I think you're absolutely right. I think it's an allegory for any artist pursuing art as a means of a career. And, you know, ultimately it comes down to the artist being the determiner of their own definition of a success. So if you define yourself success by external measurement, then that can be certainly very disappointing in a hindsight of a life devoted to the arts. And but there are other measures of defining success.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and that's something obviously I think a lot of people learn, which is that you do have to kind of find success or the fulfillment in the process and not so much in those external things, because you know when you put something out of the world, you have no idea how people are going to respond to it, if they're going to respond to it at all. You know, and so, and you know, look, when you make independent films, I've made 2 independent features, and in each case, from writing them to scraping together whatever limited money I needed to make them, to casting them, to shooting them, to finding a distributor, all of that in both cases was maybe a 5 or 6 year process. For movies that, you know, in the case of this one, Trouble with the Truth, you know, came and went in theaters in a week. So you have to kind of, you really have to enjoy the process and be fulfilled by that, and not, because otherwise it's too crushing, I think.
No, totally. It's a huge investment of time, energy, money, effort, everything. You know, I had a chat recently with another filmmaker, a younger filmmaker who is pursuing a different kind of aesthetic, certainly counterculture aesthetic. He's part of a DIY movement that seems to be taking off quite a bit in the UK, and he made a short called Anarchy in the UK about this movement. And he's talking about you know, essentially finding your place within the greater society as an artist. And, you know, if in our contemporary American filmmaker mentality, we feel like that place has to be found within the greater context of the establishment, well, that's going to be very disappointing for many people. And like you say in your movie, it's not necessarily about the hard work and the talent, but more so the luck and the opportunity that can be had. And so, you know, certainly a lot there to consider. I mean, do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, well, it's, you know, it's something that I have to wrestle with a lot because, you know, the movie business has changed so much in my lifetime, and just the ways people, you know, the way people or consume entertainment in general. I mean, I grew up with movies, the theatrical movie experience being sort of the center of the cultural conversation. You know, I think when I grew up in the 80s, there were theatrical movies, there was home video, but there was theatrical movies, there were a handful of TV networks. And if you were a filmmaker and your stuff was getting seen at all, you were much more, it was, I mean, it was a more, there was just, it was more homogenous, not homogenous, but it was as a communal experience. I think more movies had the potential to connect with more people and be taught. Everyone was talking about the same things. I'll put it that way. Right.
So there's less diversity, certainly.
You know, for example, and which, you know, and there are pluses and minuses to that. I mean, I think, you know, when Fatal Attraction came out, everyone was talking about that movie. Everyone saw that movie. I think nowadays, because people, you know, there's so many more things competing for people's eyeballs, whether it's, you know, the internet, streaming, video games, et cetera, et cetera. You know, I don't think that would happen again. I mean, I think now you know, the only time you ever have movies like that, it tends to be, I guess, things, you know, the big franchise tentpole movies. I guess everybody goes to see Infinity War or something like that. But the days when a movie like Fatal Attraction or Tootsie would be all anybody was talking about, that doesn't happen. And so if you grew up the way I did, thinking that, you know, wanting to be Sidney Pollack or Paul Mazursky or Walter Hill or one of these guys, those guys today, no one would know their names if they were making movies. I don't know if I'm making sense.
No, totally, I get you. I mean,
showing how, but it's sort of but it's an interesting thing. I think, you know, because you do sort of want to connect with people when you make a movie, and nowadays a lot of times you're not even sure how people are connecting with the movie. I mean, for example, Trouble with the Truth, you know, I think its main audience, it's on Amazon Prime, and that's out into the world. I don't know how many people are watching. I mean, I can tell sometimes people will review it on there or something, but
you don't get any analytics about how many views on a weekly, monthly basis?
I don't, because I will actually soon. I basically wait because on Amazon, it's going through a distributor. And I mean, I can get like a vague idea of it, but it's still, it's all a little bit more mysterious, I think, than it used to be. And certainly if your movie is on, Netflix, they don't tell you anything. There's some of these places, they don't tell you anything about how many. It's all very confusing. And so as a filmmaker, I guess the reason I'm not being particularly articulate about this is I'm still wrestling with it myself. Is it forces you to wrestle with the question of why are you doing this? What is important to you in terms of how your movie's seen, how many people see it, all that kinds of things. Because I think it's very different. And I think there are certain kinds of, careers that no longer exist. I mean, I think there are very few people, there are a handful of people like Paul Thomas Anderson, or Barry Jenkins or whatever, Damien Chazelle, who have managed to carve out this place where they're sort of making very personal, distinctive films that sort of do make a little bit of a stamp in the culture. But there are many fewer of those than there used to be. And it's, I think, so again, it forces you as a filmmaker to kind of ask yourself what's really important to you. And I think in my case, I'm still wrestling with it, and I still, I still sort of am always trying to figure out where my place is, because I also have this side that doesn't really care about that. That's more about the process, and I just enjoy being on a set and working with actors and working with the camera and things like that. And so that side of me is sort of moving towards more wanting to direct things like episodic TV, where it's not at all, if you're a director, it's not really at all yours. But on the other hand, it gives you this opportunity to sort of direct more than you get to if you're making independent films, where, again, if back to that point about how each of my movies took 5 or 6 years beginning to end, in each case, only 2 or 3 weeks of that time was actually spent on a set making the movie.
Right. Yeah, I think it's a great point, and I think a lot of filmmakers really surround that. Do you have me on 2 mics by chance? So I can hear a feedback. Maybe I'm on the phone or iPad as well.
I don't think I only have you on one, but maybe if I just turn this down a little bit or something, or I can put headphones.
Perfect.
I don't know. Is that any better?
Yeah. So I don't think you're alone, and I think a lot of that question is, hey, where is the artistic versus commercial risk reward, that I want to manage as a filmmaker, and where's the reach, and the process, and my personal stamp, and pursuing the artistry of it, the art of it, and then there's the more commercial side, and potentially, if that meets nicely with a desire to have more of the process side of it, experiencing directing, well, that's definitely a good win-win there. So, but it's all this risk-reward proposition, right? Depending on, the needs of the filmmaker. So that said, again, you're really not alone there. I think a lot of filmmakers can sympathize with that on, the myriad of levels that they sit on. And the changing landscape of distribution, essentially. So that said, looking back on the film, The Trouble with Truth, what do you believe the message, what do you see as the message of that film now?
I think if there's a message, I mean, again, I don't necessarily know if there's a message as much as it's raising questions and issues to think about. And I suppose the message of that in a way would be, it would be sort of to embrace this is a simplistic way of putting it in a way, but it's sort of to embrace the complexity and contradictions of life. Because I think, again, in the case of this movie, you basically have 2 characters whose worldviews are somewhat diametrically opposed, but I don't think either one of them is necessarily, right definitively or wrong definitively. I think there's sort of, both of their points of view have validity. And so I guess the message, for lack of a better word, would just be that's to acknowledge and embrace that complexity. I think right now, I mean, it's stating the obvious probably to say that things now tend to get oversimplified. I mean, all you have to do is go on Twitter or Facebook and see the ways that people talk about anything from politics to their reaction to Solo, and it's like everyone goes into these camps that are very, you know, that are kind of strident and sometimes, again, black and white and simplistic. And I guess this is a movie that sort of lives comfortably in the grays, you know, and that's sort of what I was going for.
Okay, cool. Well, let's explore that a little bit, can we?
Sure.
So from my perspective, you know, both of the characters, although their color or tone of hue may differ a little bit, their ultimate behavior and actions are very similar. So to underscore that, they're both essentially rather judgmental, rather opinionated, and they're negotiating something that's essentially not important. The important is that they've both made their actions, they're where they are today, and they're continuing to lead lives of deception.
Mm-hmm.
So they're deceiving their partners, they're often deceiving themselves, and they're engaged in, you know, judgments. They're judging each other, they're judging themselves, they're judging their daughter's boyfriend to be. So they seem to me to be rather mature characters, and not yet gone to a place where their actions are more in integrity with their ideals.
Yeah, I mean, I think the judgmental aspect of the characters, I think, really grows out of the fact that they both, you know, I think neither one of them, basically they both have somehow gotten to a point in their lives where they're not really happy with the choices they've made. And I think that manifests itself. They kind of, rather than looking too deeply inward at themselves, I think their tendency has been to direct that outward, to sort of judge, to sort of, maybe it's maybe like a, you know, protesting too much sort of thing. You know, they judge they're judging each other and other people and making these grand proclamations that really kind of grow out of insecurity in a way. I think, you know, I think they both are sort of maybe unsatisfied and unfulfilled, and so in a way it's sort of a defense mechanism to point out what they think everyone else is doing wrong, because it sort of gets them off the hook a little bit, if that makes sense.
Yeah, no, totally. I mean, that's kind of what I think is there as well. And, you know, interestingly enough, the trouble with truth is that neither of them have yet to look at it.
Mm-hmm. So, exactly. It's hard to face.
Yeah. So, you know, for me, the message of the film is like, hey, if you don't want to wake up, you know, 50, 60 something, you know, and be disappointed with your life, you might as well face it as it's happening.
Yeah, that's absolutely. You've put it much better than I did. Or could.
Thanks. Well, you brought us there, so thanks for that. So last question, in reflection, looking back at your experience making this film, this could be both sides in terms of on the set and off the set in your personal life. How have you changed?
Boy, well, it's interesting that because in terms of the intersection of the movie with my personal life, you know, the movie was made basically in the time between when I made the movie and when it came out. I fell in love, and now I'm engaged to the woman I fell in love with.
Hey,
and I think probably, you know, I don't think I possibly, if I made this movie today, I mean, the movie already feels like sort of a time capsule for me of, I was probably much more like both of those characters at the time that I wrote the movie and made it. I think I probably hadn't quite, in terms of talking about them being immature and, you know, not having faced certain things. I think that was me. I think I probably hadn't. And then after I made the movie, I mean, the movie kind of indirectly led to this relationship I'm in, because the woman who I'm with now, we had known each other years ago and hadn't seen each other, and then ran into each other when she came to a screening of the movie, when she read about it and thought, oh, is that guy I used to know? I'm going to go. She came to see the movie. We reconnected, fell in love. And I think that I, in the process of my relationship with her, sort of acknowledged a lot of the things about myself that maybe I hadn't, and grew a lot, and sort of, again, resolved a lot of the issues these characters in this movies have are things that I used to have that I sort of have since resolved. So it's an interesting movie. Even by the time it was out and playing film festivals, I had already kind of changed into a different person. And so, And I think that's kind of the, in a way, that's kind of the fun thing about making movies, is if you do them in a personal way, is on the one hand, you can look back at them and maybe cringe a little bit if you've changed. You know, I made a movie, I made a movie before this one that was a super low budget horror movie called Bad Reputation. And I made that one about 10 years ago, and I hadn't looked at it again until very recently, because it was going on Amazon streaming, and I had to watch it again just to make sure that the master was okay and all that. And I watched it, and it felt like it had been made by an entire difference. I mean, good and bad. Like there are ways in which that movie, it has a fearless.
Sorry, Jim, you cut out for a second. You said it felt like it was made with what's that?
It felt like it was made by an entirely different person. And it had a fearlessness to it that I don't have anymore. And in some ways that meant there are things in it that I'm a little bit embarrassed by now, that are sort of like either just in all kinds of ways, both technical, content, whatever. But it's also, I think, kind of the neat thing. Like I don't like when filmmakers, you know, there's some filmmakers who I like a lot, like Michael Mann and Francis Coppola, people like that, who are always going back and recutting their own movies for different home video releases and stuff like that. And I sort of don't like that. I think a movie should be a snapshot of where the filmmaker was at the time it was made, like of their mind and of the world at that moment, and of the cultural attitudes. And so even if there are things in it later you're embarrassed by because either the world has changed or you've changed or you're a better filmmaker, I think you should kind of leave it alone. And I do, again, already I sort of look at Trouble with the Truth as like, well, that was a snapshot of how I was thinking at that moment in my life. And, you know, I'm very different now. But as a filmmaker, I don't know that I've changed that much. I mean, I think I was very lucky with Trouble with the Truth in that it was a movie that came out pretty much the way I wanted it to. I mean, I got the actors I thought were great, and everything went, you know, it went very smoothly. It's not a movie that I look at where I feel like there's a lot of compromise. I mean, any minor flaws in it are just of my own ineptitude.
You know, so it sounds like, to summarize, I mean, it sounds like you've changed quite a bit. In general, you've matured. From the one film that you made to this film, it sounds like you've lost a level of fearlessness that you might want to kind of tap into. I'm not sure if you were saying that or not, but you know, since you bring it up, it's interesting. It's also very much a theme of the Trouble with Truth, is this playing it safe versus risking, you know, your artistic aesthetic, whatever artistic ambitions. So I guess, you know, for me, in listening to what you said, an interesting line came up that I heard, or aphorism, or that it goes like this: you can be right, or you can let love win.
Mm-hmm.
And that seems to be really apropos to your characters and their struggle. So, you know, on that note, I use that very often. I wouldn't say every day, but I reference that very often. And, you know, I guess in wrapping up, you know, I would be a little more interested if we could push the terms of your growth and as a filmmaker, just as an individual, and be a little more specific about how you feel you've matured.
Well, I don't think I'm, as an individual, I don't think I'm as self-absorbed. I mean, I think I think about the consequences of my actions on other people a little more. I think I'm a little more honest. And again, I mean, speaking to what you were saying about the characters in this movie, I think I'm more honest with myself about, you know, again, about my own responsibility for things.
Yeah. Well, that no doubt will serve you, you know, as much, if not more, in life as in your continued filmmaking.
Yeah.
You know, so I think that's, you know, to all our audiences, where they're filmmakers or fans, I think that's really wise advice. I mean, the more real and honest you can get with yourself, the more you can have to offer through your creativity.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Well, Jim, thank you so much. It was a pleasure.
Thank you so much. No, this was great. I mean, it's great to talk to somebody who looks at films so thoughtfully. So I really appreciate you. You made me see about it in a while. So that's great.
That's my job. I'm glad I was able to follow through on that a bit. And thank you, Jim. I look forward to staying in touch. Look forward to seeing more movies from you. And have a great day. Thanks again.
Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Oh, Jim.
Yes.
Hey guys, thanks for tuning in this week. If you enjoyed the video, please subscribe and leave us a like and or a comment. It makes a big difference. Play It Forward is brought to you by Digipops, where we're building a community to put film and filmmaker discovery in your hands. Here, filmmakers and fans, the creative class, recognizes each other fairly and transparently through a community-curated film festival each quarter. It's coming soon. Thank you.